Hey guys, and welcome back to Dark Matter Podcast. I'm Dominique.
And I'm Avalon.
Today we're going to be talking about an extremely heavy topic, and that is the Rwandan Genocide. And despite being one of the world's most devastating genocides, you might never have even heard of it. And I think this topic is really worth mentioning because it deals with a lot of social issues that led up to the genocide, as well as government corruption. And Avalon, this is something you've really been passionate about, so do you want to tell us how you found out about it?
Yeah, for sure. So this is something I care quite a lot about. And I first learned about it from, I was actually a pastor at a church I went to as a kid. So he would always tell us about Rwanda and about the genocide because he did missionary work there, and he would go back after the genocide. And he'd even go into the prisons and speak to people who participated in the genocide. So that just captivated me as a child, and I just feel like it never really left me. I've always been interested in it. And I went on to write a paper on it later on in a philosophy of race class that I took in undergrad. And so it's just kind of always been in my mind. I feel like it's just always been something that's really interested me. So when we think about racial genocides, I think we probably automatically think about the Holocaust because that's just the biggest one, the most well-known one. And with that one, obviously there was the Nazis that were seen as Aryan, and then there was the Jewish citizens. So there's some kind of difference. But what you probably wouldn't think of when you say a racial genocide is two groups that are basically the same, that have the same location, or they live in the same location, speak the same languages, practice the same religions, look very similar, and have similar cultures. But that is exactly what the two groups in Rwanda were that the genocide happened to. So it was the Hutus and the Tutsis. So they're two groups of people, and like I said, they were practically the same, living in harmony for history, all of history before this. But they became divided through discrimination of the colonizing country, which was Belgium. We'll get into that. But yeah, so basically this division led to the mass murder and rape of the minority group, which was the Tutsis, as well as many moderate Hutus by the majority group, which was the Hutus. So the Hutus became radicalized and killed a lot of Tutsis and moderate Hutus. So Hutus and Tutsis, although they were pretty much the same, like I said, it was really the Belgium's occupation and their tactics, their antics, what they they planted these seeds of discrimination and of segregation, and that's really what led to the genocide. So looking at what race even is, this is relevant because, like I mentioned earlier, with racial genocides, usually there's some kind of clear difference, but here there really wasn't. So what even is race, right? So generally speaking, it's defined as physical characteristics like eye color, skin tone, and hair texture. And according to Lawrence Blum, the concept of race in regards to the inherent value of humans was not developed until Europeans first came to Africa. So before that, there wasn't really a value put on race, or I don't think it was really even thought about that much.
Right, and I think this topic's really interesting to me too because I took several sociology classes when I was in college, and I think that's the one thing that you kind of wonder once you've taken a class like that is what is race? Because it kind of becomes apparent that it's basically a social construct, like you mentioned, these two groups of people were basically the same before a bunch of colonizers showed up and told them that they were different races.
Exactly. That's why this case is so interesting to me because you can literally see the lifespan of a race come into, you can see a race be created where there wasn't one before, which is so insane to me. And it just shows that race is really something that's kind of made up until we acknowledge it, until we make it a thing, basically. Mm-hmm. And so, like I mentioned, the Hutus and Tutsis were very similar, but they did have some differences in terms of physical appearance, reportedly. So, for example, Tutsis were supposedly taller, and it was said they had narrower noses. But the evidence is not really strong for this. There's also, it's said that if there was a difference in height, so the Hutus being shorter and Tutsis being taller, it wasn't because of anything other than like adaptation. Because so basically, like the Tutsis and Hutus had different occupations generally. So that was one difference. That Hutus were more of like I believe they were more in like working in the farms, whereas Tutsis were breeders. So their occupations gave way to one group being a little taller, one being a little shorter after generations and generations of partaking in that occupation. So it was really, if there was differences, it was definitely like the environment that brought it on. I really don't think you could see someone and be like, they're definitely a Hutu or they're definitely a Tutsi, because at the end of the day, you could be a short Tutsi or a tall Hutu. So yeah, I think that the differences in physical appearance were little to none, and there's explanations for why they existed if they did.
Yeah, I mean, to me, basically seeing Darwinism in action, what it seems like, because it seems that those differences and characteristics evolve through, like you said, their work occupation or their environment. So to me, like, it's very interesting because we're basically seeing evolution, working.
Yeah, it's crazy because that's another really interesting thing about this case to me is that it's like you see a race come into place, but you also see these differences take place over time that like actually changes their bodies. I mean, if it did change their bodies. So yeah, I thought it's pretty insane.
Yeah, definitely. So now let's talk about ethnicity. And ethnicity is usually defined by a nation of origin, like ancestors, language, religion, and culture. As for ethnic differences, the Hutu and Tutsis had few to none. They shared a nation, they spoke the same language, practiced the same religion, and found themselves members of the same culture. The major difference between the two of them were their professions, like we mentioned before, but it's not unheard of to find many different professions within one culture anyway, so it's not that out of the blue. Even though the Hutus and Tutsis had very few differences, the countries that colonized Rwanda decided that differences were enough to enforce segregation and other acts of discrimination. So now let's talk about the racialization of the Hutus and Tutsis. So the actual genocide itself only occurred within a 100-day window in 1994, but there was so much that led up to the tragedy that we have to look deeper into Rwandan history to see how it all started. Rwanda, as a country, is no larger than the state of Massachusetts and was ranked as one of the poorest in Africa for many years prior to the genocide. And its main inhabitants were either Tutsis or Hutus, and the Tutsis were associated with higher social standing than Hutus, but the term Hutu and Tutsi can't be boiled down to social classes. Their original meanings actually was a professional one describing Hutus as farmers and Tutsis as breeders. And Tutsis were traditionally considered superior due to religious origin myths of the Rwandan people, and it basically said that Tutsis came from another country. This was stressed by the European countries, like Belgium, that actually colonized Rwanda.
Right, and the reason that these colonizers like just held on so tightly to this idea that Tutsis were from elsewhere is their belief in the Hamitic hypothesis. So the Hamitic hypothesis claims that it's really whack, you guys. It basically claims that anything favorable in Africa was brought there by the Hamites, a superior Caucasian race. So basically, they're saying that anything good in Africa isn't really African; it was brought there by white people,
Which
which
is so ridiculous to me. Like,
it's just stupid. It's just I don't know where it came from. I don't know why they really believe that, and it's just really disgusting, honestly.
I know, like, basically all these white people just came and were like, we've never been here before, but everything that's good in your life, that's because of us.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, "Oh, yeah, we probably did that." Like, no, you didn't.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and there was even someone, he was one of the colonizers that came into Rwanda. He was like a church father. He was even like quoted as saying that a Tutsi was a European under a black skin, which first of all doesn't even make sense, but secondly is just such a disgusting thing to say. So you can see where their mind was and what they were coming in with. So the Hamitic hypothesis played a huge role in racializing Hutus and Tutsis because it claimed ancestral differences in the groups. Because basically, by deciding that Tutsis were from a different ancestor and they actually immigrated to Rwanda, it then decided that Hutus were the indigenous people that were already there. And I don't know, I feel like when I first found that out, I thought like automatically, I think that's like they would see the Hutus as superior then because they were the first ones there. But no, it was the opposite. They saw it as like Tutsis were like basically white and they came there and like
Hmm.
conquered it. but like that's really not the case. They pretty much just like rewrote their history for them.
Yeah, and that's actually really interesting because it reflects so much of American history as well. You know, like Christopher Columbus came here, and basically treated the indigenous people terribly, and you know, like we can see that in so many different places as well. Also, of you know, like other colonizers coming into this country and basically like you know again colonizing it, but also creating racial and social rules that weren't there before.
Exactly. So, okay, so Belgium took their belief in the Hamitic hypothesis to the extreme, and they eventually administered a census to everyone in Rwanda. And so basically, like with the census, they labeled everyone as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, which Twa was like a very small percent of the population. Pretty much everyone was Hutu or Tutsi. But before this, they didn't really feel a need to separate themselves. You know what I mean? It just wasn't really something that was like a part of their identity. Like I don't think they really felt the need to differentiate themselves. But Belgium was really the one that came in and forced this on them. And they actually even gave them identification cards, which these were imposed on all Rwandan citizens to label them as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. And this was extremely important for later on in the genocide because these ended up being used to identify, obviously, people as whatever group they belong to.
Wow, that's crazy to me because to me see like when you mention the identification cards that seems very similar to what happened to Jews during the Holocaust. You know, it was mandatory for them to wear the Star of David, and that really I don't know brings the parallel, makes it really obvious to me like the way that these people were treated. And I don't know, it's just crazy to think that you know like again like they were so similar that you couldn't even tell them apart if it weren't for this identification card.
So Belgium made political, cultural, and social, oh, and even religious decisions based on this racial ideology of the Hamitic hypothesis. And one of the major, like, deciding decisions was changing the school system in Rwanda. So this was done by segregating Hutus and Tutsis. And what they did was instead of, I mean, because we've experienced this in our own country, that separate is not equal, but they actually didn't even like pretend that it was equal. They specifically separated them so they could give Tutsi students a better education. And this was a decision made by Monsignor Leon Klass of the Catholic Church. And his justification for this policy was that basically he said, you know, every child deserves an education, but Hutus only deserve an education that meets the need of a farmer. So this led to Tutsis being adequately educated to hold administrative positions, which is exactly what Belgium wanted, because if Tutsis had all of the like the higher education, then they were going to be the ones in charge. That's just the way it was. So yeah, they put this in place as it was a blatant act of discrimination.
Yeah, and it seems to me it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like they're telling the people that Tutsis are the, you know, higher race, they're the more dominant race, and that um, Hutus are basically just farmers, you know, and again, like that's basically fulfilling the prophecy because they're giving Tutsis higher education while Hutus only deserve the bare minimum, basically.
Exactly. That's precisely what it is that they're making what they're saying come true by actually like forcing it on the people. So it wasn't that they were superior to start with, or they were to end with, really. They were just giving them different opportunities, blatantly just discriminating against them. And Belgium also wanted to reform the administration, or basically like their way of government in Rwanda. And the three goals for this were first to reallocate the power from the monarch, which is the Mwami, to the chiefs, which were local authorities. And then the second reason they wanted to do this was to distance the local administration from their communities, so that basically the chiefs were the only ones that went to the colonizers, not the communities themselves. And what that did was leave the communities with no voice because nobody was hearing them out. It was just the chiefs that were going to the colonizers, and that was the only communication that was happening. And lastly, they wanted to racialize the local chiefs in charge to make sure they were all Tutsis. And What I mean by this is before this all happened, there was basically, they called it like the Trinity of Chiefs, where there was a chief of land, chief of pastures, and chief of the men. And traditionally, the chief of land was a Hutu, and the other two were Tutsis. So they weren't, I mean, like it wasn't like necessarily like a complete like 50-50 split, because there's three obviously, but there was like a checks and balances kind of, because there was a Hutu in charge and there's Tutsis in charge, so that everybody was really getting their needs met. Um, but because of what Belgium did, like basically Belgium chose to conflate all these three chiefs into one, and of course it was a Tutsi, and so the Hutu representation was just gone. So Hutu peasants formally would have, representation from the Trinity. They would have their voices heard and their needs met, and that was absolutely taken away. So their agenda, Belgium's agenda, didn't only discriminate towards Hutus, it also left them vulnerable and without a voice. So it just like everything they did was just deepening this divide between these two groups and making it worse and worse.
So let's talk about the events that led up to the genocide. So Rwanda was first colonized by Germany, but it was eventually decolonized and put under Belgium's control after World War I. And in the late 1950s, the Hutu peasant revolution began when Hutus killed hundreds of Tutsis and forced thousands out of their homes. Belgian authorities then encouraged this revolution, which led to the independence of Rwanda in 1962, and Rwanda had actually become a quote-unquote Hutu-dominated republic. And over the next 5 years, 10 similar attacks were committed, and this took many Tutsi lives and exiled even more. And by the 1980s, 480,000 Rwandans had become refugees. And some of those refugees went on to form a militia that became a driving force in the genocide. So the Rwandan Patriotic Front, aka the RPF, came into existence in Uganda during the late 1980s. The RPF was a military movement made up of exiled Tutsis in Uganda who wanted to come home to Rwanda. And the RPF attacked Rwanda in the early 1990s, initiating a civil war and getting the attention of the Organization of African Unity and the UN. These organizations sent aid to end the civil war, but it didn't help much. In fact, following the start of the civil war, Tutsis were still in Rwanda and were all said to be part of the RPF, and Hutus were of the opposite party / moderate Hutus were called traitors. The Rwandan radio stations also began to spread untrue claims about Tutsis, making the divide even worse. And in an attempt to end the 3-year civil war, the Arusha Peace Treaty was signed by the RPF representatives and the Rwandan government in 1993. While the peace agreement was signed by Rwandan politicians, however, they were also covertly planning the genocide of all Tutsis and moderate Hutus. The idea of Hutu power became much more mainstream after the Arusha Peace Agreement, and this once underground movement was now embraced by the government and the majority of Hutus.
Right, so this leads us to the actual genocide, like what actually went down during those 100 days or those 3 months. So it began on the 7th of April, 1994, and roughly 3 months later, there was 800,000 people killed, and that constituted about 75% of Tutsis. So, like I said earlier, the Tutsis were the minority population to start with, and now 75% of them were wiped out. And another part that is, I think, talked about a little bit less is that between 150,000 and 250,000 women were raped. And not only is this horribly traumatic and just awful, but it also spread, or it led to the spread of AIDS. As you could imagine, there's so many women being raped. It really contributed to the AIDS pandemic. So this was just obviously a tragedy. So this genocide has been said to only fall short to the Holocaust in terms of like the scale and speed. So it was literally one of the fastest and biggest genocides ever. And one of the most disturbing things about the Rwandan genocide is, and something that kind of differentiates it from, for example, the Holocaust, is that in the Holocaust, it was this organized group of Nazis that were coming in and killing, and segregating and then killing Jews. But in this case, it wasn't like this organized group coming in and doing it. It was the actual perpetrators, the people who were killing Tutsis, were the neighbors, coworkers, acquaintances, even relatives. And there's instances of like Hutu wives slaughtering their Tutsi husbands, or Hutu-Tutsi mixed children slaughtering their Tutsi mother, for example. So this was happening between families, it was happening between coworkers, and the weird thing is that it was happening between people who are perfectly civil and fine with each other before this all started happening and before these crazy ideas were implanted in their minds, really. And they became radicalized. And it's just so sad to think that. And I think that's one of the reasons also that people are so captivated by this case is that it was literally people they knew.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most devastating parts of it to me is that, like we mentioned before with the Holocaust, it was, it wasn't families against families, it was one race kind of against another. And in this case, it wasn't that. It wasn't some unknown enemy. It was people that they cared about and maybe even their children, which is just horrifying to me that they managed to do this much damage, like turning the people against each other in such a short amount of time. It's really devastating. It's horrible.
Right. And I think that one thing I wanted to mention that, like, I know it's a common question that comes up is like, well, if they look so similar, how did they even know in the heat of battle, like, who was who? Like, were they just killing it at random? Like, how did they really know people were Tutsi or Hutu? So, as I mentioned earlier, the identification cards played a big role in this, but also because it was conducted by literally neighbors, family, etc., etc., pretty much everybody knew at this point who was Hutu and who was Tutsi. Because it's been, I mean, maybe before Belgium, they might not have known who was who because, again, it wasn't really a big deal. But after Belgium made it such a big deal and literally segregated these communities, everybody knew who was who. So that was something I just wanted to mention that if you were wondering, like, how did they even know? That's pretty much how. And so I also did want to mention that not every Hutu participated in the slaughtering of the Tutsis because, again, Hutus were the majority of the country. So it's not like every single one of them was out there killing Tutsis, and many neither attempted to rescue Tutsis or were targeted by Hutu extremists, so they were just kind of bystanders, which it's like we can look back and say that they were bad for not doing anything, but at the same time they were probably thinking like, I want to protect my kids, I want to protect me, I don't want to get involved in this at all, like I just don't want to die. It was just
Yeah.
it was just a crazy time, and I think they were just trying to protect themselves. So I just want to mention that also, that it wasn't like every Hutu was out there killing people.
Well, I think, it's easy to go back and say, like hindsight is 2020. It's easy to say like, oh, they should have done something, but at the same time we kind of have to like look at ourselves, in our daily lives and say like how many times do we actually stand up and say something, if we see anything weird or see something we disagree with. I feel like it's hard to speak up and, because our initial thought I think is should kind of just go on with our lives and ignore it.
Exactly. We just want to blend in and we don't want to,
Hmm.
the bystander effect is a thing in psychology that, like, the more people there are,
Right.
like, the less likely we are to actually intervene because we want to fit in. We don't want to make a problem. And especially when people are being killed and it just happens all at once. Um, yeah, people don't like they didn't want to step in. So I think that's just something I wanted to mention. But as far as like the foreign aid goes, so there was the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda. We're going to call it UNAMIR, and it led UN soldiers to become bystanders because they kept this mandate in place that basically said, so the UN soldiers that were in Rwanda, it basically told them like you can use force if it's in self-defense, but if it's not in self-defense, you can't use force. You can only be there as a bystander. And the poor troops, like, I mean, I don't know, I feel like as far as like the accounts I heard, they were really they wanted to help. I mean, like, why would they get sent to this country they've never been to before, during a huge civil war basically, if they didn't want to help, you know what I mean? Like, and if they weren't there to
Hmm.
help. And so they wanted to help, but they were told that you're breaking mandate and you're going against the UN, which obviously is a huge entity, if you do anything to help them. And I think a lot of people rightly saw this as useless. Like, why were they even
Hmm.
there if you were just going to have them, like, stand around, basically? Like, that's just putting them in danger and not helping. So, what was the point of that? I don't understand that at all. And then, like, the UN made it even worse because they reduced their UNIMER, like, the amount of people there, by 90% to only 270 men within the first 2 weeks of the genocide. So the genocide started, and then by the next over the next 2 weeks, they reduced down their group of men there to 270 in a country of millions that were all slaughtering each other. Like, they had 270 men. What were they really supposed to do? Um, and Belgium decided not to send any aid after losing 10 soldiers at the start of the genocide, which is there's just so much to be said there because it's literally all Belgium's fault. So it sucks that they decided not to send aid, basically.
I know that, like, that's what I was gonna say. It's basically their fault. Like, they're the ones who created these racial tensions between these two groups of people, and they're the ones who basically created this whole system. Like, it's all their fault. And then basically, when it poses a problem to them, they wash their hands of it. Like, oh, you know what? Like, it's not worth it for us to send help for this because 10 of our soldiers died, when it, like, really, like, it's your fault. It's just astounding to me, the fact that they did this.
Yeah, and like of course Belgium, like when they first occupied Rwanda, it was many, many years before this actually happened. So maybe they were able to think like, oh, it's not really our fault anymore. But at the end of the day, it's like you have to take responsibility. It's like, yeah, maybe it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't your current administration that did this because they were occupied by Belgium many years before the actual genocide. But you have to take some kind of responsibility. I can't imagine that they didn't feel bad at all. They didn't feel guilty. And they really wanted to say, oh, we lost 10 guys, we're out. It's like that
Right.
sucks that you lost 10 men, but they're losing 800,000. So are you just going to
Mm-hmm.
sit by like and I think that unfortunately this is something that happens a lot that when things like this are happening in Africa or in the Middle East, the West just is able to turn a blind eye and just be like, oh, I don't see that. You just, nothing's
Right.
happening. Because I mean, even the U.S. they didn't have a vested interest in Rwanda. There's not a lot of rich natural resources there, and it's no surprise they didn't send aid at all. And actually, I just found a quote earlier that was from Bill Clinton because he was the president at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and he went on record saying that he said like we couldn't have probably wouldn't have been able to stop the murders altogether, but we could have made a big difference, and I regret not sending anybody. And it's like I'm glad that he at least acknowledged that like of course they weren't going to be able to stop all these people from being killed. They weren't going to be able to stop every single murder, but I mean
Mm-hmm.
come on, like it's we're America, like we could have done something. We could have sent somebody over there and they just didn't have an interest in it. They didn't want to. They didn't see a purpose in it. Um
Right.
and so they didn't. And that really really sucks.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like our country, like, you could say, like, unless they have a personal stake in it, unless, like, another country has something they want, like, they won't really get involved. Like you said, like, there was nothing of interest to them in Rwanda, so it's easy to say, like, oh, I'm washing my hands of this problem, like, it's none of my business.
Yeah, and it's funny how, or it's not funny, but I guess ironic how in other situations there's times
Mm-hmm.
where we have really no business being in a country, but
Right.
oh, they happen to have gas and then we happen to end up there. You know what I mean? Causing a problem and stirring things up. So it just really shows the true colors of the government. I mean,
Yeah, it
it's
really
sad, but it's
does.
true. And so France is one country that did try to intervene. They intervened with 2,500 men, but the the thing is, by the time they intervened, it was already June 23rd. So if you remember, it started April 7th and lasted 3 months. So by the time they got there, it had already been 2.5 months. And like obviously they didn't know when it was gonna stop. You know what I mean? It's not like they knew like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, we have a 3 month timeline. Like obviously they didn't know, but they waited 2.5 months. Like pretty much like the devastation had already occurred by that point. There was only 2 weeks left of that like the genocide continued on for. And in addition to them taking so long to send people, they were criticized because there was instances where they let perpetrators get away. They didn't save as many Tutsis as they really could have, and they didn't stop the Rwandan Defense Forces, who they have given military training to in the years leading up to the genocide. So pretty much I don't know the exact situation with that, but I think they had either given them like guns or I mean obviously they gave them military training and they could have done something to stop them and they just kind of didn't because I don't know because they felt guilty or something because they were the ones that gave them the training. I'm not really sure, but yeah, so even France, which I would say seemed to have given the biggest amount of aid, it wasn't enough. It was too little, too late, and
Mm-hmm.
it didn't really. I mean, I guess it probably helped because within 2 weeks of them sending the people over, the genocide was over. But in my mind, it seems like it was probably winding down by that point, anyways. So I really just honestly the world failed Rwanda. They really did. And I know some people will say like, oh well, it's not our business. It's not for us to do. It's
Mm-hmm.
not for us to get ourselves involved in. But it's just like this was literally a humanitarian crisis. This was crazy. And like I didn't mention this earlier, but I remember you mentioned that there was the radio stations that they started like spreading false rumors in through. Well, when the genocide started, it was literally over the radio stations. They sent a broadcast and they were like, it's time. Like they had been planning the genocide. They're like, do it. And
Oh
within
my
hours,
god.
it started. Yeah, I totally forgot to mention that because it's so eerie to me. So it literally started within hours of that being broadcast. So this was like out of nowhere. Like people, obviously there was a lot of contention. Like people knew things weren't good, but it literally just started one day. Like you know what I mean? Just like one day at some point in the day, people just started getting murdered, and these poor people. I just can't imagine what it was like to go through that. Um, and even if you weren't, like obviously if you weren't killed or nobody when your family was killed, that's just such deep trauma. And the fact that if at least a few more countries of great power and influence would have done something, I feel like it could have been so much less traumatic and so much less damage could have been done. But again, people just didn't have a vested interest in little Rwanda. You know, they didn't see anything important there, and
Right,
it's
yeah.
just really disappointing.
But yeah, so right now let's talk about where Rwanda is as a nation today, because I feel like it's definitely important to talk about where they are today. So their current president, Paul Kagame, has said this about Rwanda's comeback now 26 years after the genocide. He said, "Our bodies and minds bear amputations and scars, but none of us is alone. We Rwandans have granted ourselves a new beginning. We exist in a state of permanent commemoration every day in all that we do. Today, light radiates from this place." And although some support President Kagame, others have criticized his antics as he has been known to stifle opposition. You know, for example, he has been in power for over 20 years now, despite Rwanda's two-term limit. And the way he actually got around this rule was by changing the constitution to allow him to be in power until 2030. So, you know, like that's a long time. He's already been in power for quite a long time now, for over 20 years, and he's going to be in power for even longer. And during Rwanda's 2017 elections, he won with a 98.8% of the votes. His two main opponents were soon to be in prison and already in prison, respectively. So there's actually a memorial museum called the Kigali Genocide Memorial, which is Kigali is our capital city. So you know they are making strides to kind of acknowledge what they've done. They definitely aren't hiding it away, and I think they're making strides to definitely move forward with their lives. And actually, one good thing I was gonna say about Rwanda is that their parliament is now 64% of women, as compared to the worldwide average, which is 22%. And this actually leaves them at the number one for percent of women, or for female parliamentarians in the world. And life expectancy, literacy, school enrollment, the economy, and spending on healthcare have also improved. So, you know, so they're definitely on the rise now. It's definitely a change from what it was during the genocide. And there's actually this YouTube channel I watched called the Bucket List Family, and they actually traveled to Rwanda, and they mentioned that their families were originally really nervous for them to go there because, you know, it has a reputation for being a scary place. But they talked about how everyone is super welcoming and friendly, and that everyone should definitely visit it. Their economy is doing really well right now, they're booming, and they actually visited the genocide memorial, and they talked about how it was a deeply moving experience because they actually saw like the faces of the people who were murdered. You know, there were some children and there were some family members, mothers, fathers. It was something truly devastating. But they talked about how the Rwandans said that they chose to forgive and to move on because, you know, like they could focus on the hate and the violence that happened, but at the end of the day, that doesn't really do anything good. So I think that that's a very positive outlook, at least. You know, like we can't erase the violence of the past, but we can definitely do our part to accept and, you know, move on with our lives. So I think that's a very good message for them to be living by right now.
Right. And I think as far as like final thoughts or like my final thoughts on this case go, is that basically, I mean, it was Belgium. Like it was Belgium that created an atmosphere that basically made genocide inevitable. Like at that point, it was just a matter of time before they hit a boiling point, and it wasn't the Rwandans to blame. I mean, obviously, once they started killing people, it's like you have to take responsibility for your actions. If you're out there killing people, you were killing people, and that's not right. But I'm saying like the fact that it happened, I really do blame Belgium for, and you can see this just by looking at how Rwanda was before Belgium colonize them, because Hutu Tutsi marriages were very common, and the differences between the group, as we mentioned, were hardly discussed. It was really not a point of talking. It was not something that people mentioned, and they really just lived in harmony. Like, it wasn't an issue. I feel like it was just something that was so small. It was something like the type of car you drive or something. You know what I mean? It's not something to like be divided over, until Belgium came in and really made it something to divide each other over, and just like planted these seeds in their mind. I really do blame Belgium for what happened there, and I think some people have heard of this story, but they might not have heard of the genocide, but they might not realize that it wasn't just because I think that all too often people think of Africans as like, oh, like Africa's like uncivilized, or they have tribes and it's like this and that. And I just hate that mindset, because like in this case, like they were literally a harmonious society, you know. They had their shit together. They had their checks and balances, and like they were, you know, they were living in a beautiful, harmonious place. I mean, it was very poor there, but they were making it work, you know what I'm saying? And it was really
Right.
Belgium that came in, that where we would see Belgium as more like closer to our society. You know, they're part of the West and they're more like civilized, quote unquote. But they were the ones that came in and caused this. It was really them. And I don't think I hope people won't forget that. And I think that what I took away from this is basically that our differences should serve as a great equalizer rather than something to separate us by. Because even though obviously differences, I mean,
Yeah.
they're differences inherently, but instead of like emphasizing our differences, we should really like, I think we should acknowledge them. We should realize that there's differences between races and cultures and like etc., but not let it change our behaviors and attitudes towards each other. We should use it as, you know, really as like to our advantage, because I think that, you know, society is best when we have lots of different groups of people working together, because then you get different perspectives and you get different mindsets, and it's just like that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be something used to, you know, drive a wedge between us, and it's just awful that that was forced upon this group of people.
Right. Well, I'll say that, if there's any bright side to this, if there's any silver lining, that it's at least that hopefully people will learn from this genocide and, kind of realize that all the things that went wrong, and hopefully something like this will just, never happen again. And so that is the end of this week's episode. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. If you guys want to follow us on social, our Instagram is Dark Matter Pod, and our Twitter is Dark Matter _pod, and our Facebook is Dark Matter Podcast. And if you want to check out any of the photos for this week's story or any of our sources, definitely check out our website, darkmatterpod.com.
Right, and if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, be sure to give us a review. You can also check us out on Spotify or on YouTube. We upload all our episodes onto YouTube as well. And be sure to spread the word if you do if you like this episode, or if you like any other episodes. Be sure to tell your friends and family. All right, thanks for listening, guys.